History is not a series of sudden moments. It is built quietly, through habits, systems, and decisions repeated over time. Before there were nations, before borders hardened and rules were enforced, people lived, worked, competed, and organized their world in ways that felt natural to them. This series explores those early patterns, not through heroes or headlines, but through the structures that formed beneath everyday life. These are the echoes that shaped the world we recognize today. By 1863, sport existed everywhere, but it did not exist the same way anywhere. Across the world, people played games rooted in local tradition. Rules varied by town, school, club, and region. Matches were negotiated before they were played. Disputes were common, and outcomes were often secondary to participation itself. Industrialization was changing daily life. Cities were growing. Work schedules were becoming standardized. Leisure time was increasingly defined rather than improvised. With this shift came pressure to organize recreation as deliberately as labor. In Britain, schools and clubs had become centers of organized play. In Europe, gymnastics and physical culture were tied to nationalism and discipline. In North America, informal competitions were beginning to draw paying crowds. Elsewhere, traditional games continued alongside imported ones, often blending rather than replacing. Sport was still mostly amateur, it was still mostly local. It was still governed by custom rather than code, but the conditions that supported informality were eroding. Larger audiences demanded clarity. Competition between unfamiliar teams required agreement. Mobility brought different traditions into contact. By 1863, the question facing sport was no longer whether people would play. It was how play would be defined. Before formal organization, sport functioned through negotiation. Rules were flexible and often unwritten. Games changed from place to place. What was allowed in one town might be forbidden in another. Even within the same sport, agreement was temporary and situational. Participation mattered more than precision. Players were often members of the same community. Disputes could be resolved through familiarity, reputation, or compromise. Authority rested with elders, captains, or mutual consent rather than neutral enforcement. This informality encouraged variation. Football-like games existed in dozens of forms. Some emphasized kicking, others carrying. Some allowed physical contact freely, others restricted it. The name of the game might be the same, but the experience was not. Spectators were present, but not central. Matches were social gatherings as much as competitions. Winning mattered, but so did ritual, celebration, and continuity. Sport reinforced belonging more than hierarchy. Importantly, there was no universal incentive to standardize. Travel was limited, communication was slow, teams rarely faced unfamiliar opponents. Without repeated external competition, variation posed little problem. Sport existed as culture, not system, but this world depended on scale. As schools expanded, clubs multiplied, and cities grew, the limits of informality became clear. Disagreements increased, injuries became harder to dismiss, matches ended in argument rather than resolution. What once felt flexible began to feel unstable. Life before structure worked until it didn't. Pressure entered sport through growth. More players meant more competition. More competition meant more disagreement. When teams from different regions met, assumptions clashed. Without shared rules, fairness was impossible to guarantee. Industrial schedules intensified this pressure. Leisure time became limited and predictable. Matches needed to start and end on time. Outcomes needed to be recognized. Informal negotiation consumed time that modern life no longer offered freely. Spectators added another layer. Crowds grew. Interest intensified. Disputes no longer affected only participants. They affected audiences. Disorder became reputational risk. Safety concerns increased as well. Physical play without regulation led to injury. As participation expanded beyond small, familiar groups, tolerance for harm declined. Pressure mounted to define acceptable conduct. These pressures did not come from ideology. They came from scale. The more people played, watched, and organized sport, the more clarity was required. The game itself had not changed. The environment around it had. Pressure demanded consistency, and consistency demanded rules. In 1863, organization emerged as solution. Clubs began meeting not to play, but to agree. Rules were debated, written, revised, and recorded. What had once been tradition became text. This moment mattered because it separated the game from the place. Once rules were written, they could travel. Once recorded, they could be enforced beyond memory. Sport could now exist independently of local custom. This was not limited to one activity. Across regions, similar movements were underway, governing bodies formed, associations standardized equipment, fields, and conduct. Competition shifted from negotiated event to scheduled fixture. Organization created continuity. Teams could meet repeatedly without renegotiation. Records could be kept. Titles could be defended. Identity extended beyond community to affiliation. Importantly, organization did not eliminate play. It redirected it. Spontaneity gave way to predictability. Variation narrowed. What was lost in flexibility was gained in reach. Sport became something that could be shared widely, because it was the same wherever it appeared. With organization came authority. Rules required enforcement. Officials emerged to interpret and apply standards. Neutral judgment replaced mutual agreement. This changed how competition was experienced. Authority was no longer situational. It was embedded. Decisions could be contested, but not ignored. Compliance became expectation. Governing bodies gained influence. They controlled membership, eligibility, and recognition. Access to competition now depended on adherence to rules. Inclusion became conditional. This authority did not rely on force. It relied on legitimacy. Players accepted it because it produced fairness. Spectators accepted it because it produced clarity. Institutions accepted it because it produced stability. Once authority took hold, sport could expand without fragmenting. And once embedded, it became difficult to reverse. By the end of 1863, something fundamental had shifted. Sport was no longer just something people did, it was something people belonged to. Rules shaped identity, affiliation mattered, loyalty extended beyond neighborhood to club, school, or association. Winning gained new meaning, outcomes were recorded, history accumulated, rivalries persisted. Memory became institutional rather than personal. Participation changed as well. Not everyone could play everywhere. Eligibility rules defined who belonged and who did not. Boundaries formed quietly, through regulation rather than exclusion. This normalization mattered. Once people grew up within structured sport, they expected it. Authority felt natural, standardization felt fair, variation felt wrong. Culture locked in because it aligned with the modern world. Sport now mirrored work. scheduled, regulated, evaluated. Leisure became organized rather than improvised. This identity would spread globally, and once established, it would define sport for generations. The decisions made in 1863 did not remain local. They became templates. Rules would be copied, associations replicated. International competition became possible because standards existed. Professionalism would follow. Global tournaments would emerge. Media would amplify what organization made legible. Modern sport did not begin with fame or money. It began with agreement. Once play was defined, everything else could be built on top of it. The past does not disappear when events end. It settles into routines, assumptions, and institutions. What begins as response becomes tradition. What feels temporary becomes normal. By tracing how structure forms and authority takes hold, we begin to see why later choices feel limited, and why certain paths seem unavoidable. The world we recognize was not built all at once. It emerged through patterns repeated until they felt permanent. These are not just moments behind us, they are echoes that continue forward,